Well, good evening. Welcome to 2015 Symposium, where our theme is Origins, Follow the Evidence Where It Leads. I've been waiting for about a decade to say this, and I am Dr. Miller, finally. 10 years, 100 years, add a couple of zeros, what does it matter, right? But I will be your MC for the weekend. I am on staff with Faculty Commons, the faculty ministry of Crew, and I direct the Christian faculty, grad, and staff network here at Purdue. Perhaps the most infamous thing that I do around black and gold country is that and especially infamous after Purdue just got whomped by IU this week. Some IU fans here. IU campus is watching as well. Is that I teach courses in philosophy and comparative religions at an IU campus. Got a red shirt on, but I've got a black coat on. I just aim to please, I guess. We welcome those of you who are here tonight, about 1,000 of you present at Purdue's Loeb Playhouse. We welcome those of you who are live streaming, approximately 1,000 right now, literally from coast to coast, from California to the Carolinas, from Texas, where all things are big, to Minnesota, where all things are cold. I was just there, I know. And we are grateful for our 24 or more sponsors that you saw probably as you entered in on the screen as it was entering or streaming, or on the brochures, or on our website. If you want to go there and take a look, symposiachristi.com, #symposiachristi.com. I am personally thankful for our executive team that helped pull this off this year, a number of various leaders in campus ministries. And I want to thank Trevor Oakes for his galactic picture that he did for us in entertaining us while we entered. The purpose of the symposium held annually is to explore and to debate some of the most probing questions about faith, reason, and life through a variety of panel discussions, lectures, debates, and even book forums. This year, the conference, as I mentioned, is centered around Origins, Follow the Evidence Where It Leads. We took that subtitle out of the words from a book by Anthony Flew, one of the most famous philosophers in the Western world, an atheist, who then wrote a book called There Is a God. And with his atheist colleagues not really happy with him, his response to them was, I had to follow the evidence where it leads. And he conceded theism now. Well, many people think that evidence and reason are contrary to belief in God, but we want to dispute that. We have many professors right here in our midst at Purdue that think otherwise. They believe, and they believe that it is smart to believe. And here are just some of those professors who are confessors.
Okay. My name is John Peterson. I'm a professor in the Department of Mathematics, and I'm a Christian because I believe in truth. As Christians, we're often presented with the idea that we either need to accept scientific truth or our religious faith. But the Bible tells us in the book of Colossians that God created all things, and in him all things hold together. So the God who created the universe, the God who holds the universe together, should certainly know his science. And so as Christians, we don't need to fear that we'll discover contradictions when we study science. And I'm excited in the next day or so to see some of the recent developments in science and discoveries in science that confirm that God is, in fact, the creator of the universe.
Hello, I'm Tim Zwier, and I'm the M.G. Mellon Distinguished Professor of Chemistry and Interim Department Head of Chemistry. Those long and somewhat cumbersome titles are things that I'm honored and grateful to hold, but there are other titles that I hold in common with Christians throughout the world that I hold even more dearly, such titles as Child of God, Forgiven Sinner, Follower of Jesus Christ.
and I'm Alex Pothen, a professor of computer science here at Purdue, and a follower of Jesus Christ. I believe that Jesus loved me so much that he lived the life that I should have lived but could not live. I believe that in his great love, he died the death that I deserve to die. And I believe that now I live my life in joyful obedience and in a relationship of mutual delight with him. And I believe the work that I do in computer science is an act of my worship to God. And I believe with the 15th century astronomer Copernicus that to know God's mighty works, to understand his wisdom, to appreciate the wonderful working of his laws, all of this is a pleasing and acceptable mode of worship to our loving God.
My name is Erica Carlson. I'm a professor of physics here at Purdue. And one of the many reasons that I'm a follower of Jesus Christ is because the accounts of origins that are in the Judeo-Christian scriptures are far more accurate than any human could have made them.
Hi, I'm Bert Chapman, a professor of library science. Personal experience and overwhelming intellectual evidence tells me that adhering to Jesus Christ and living out his personal example of perfection are the only ways to understand and deal with global problems as varied as sadistic Islamist terrorism, consciously chosen destructive sexual behavior, and numerous other problems affecting our country and world.
My name is Michael Bergman. I'm a professor of philosophy here at Purdue. I believe Jesus is God. I believe Jesus became a human, and when he lived his life, he showed us God's love for us. I believe that Jesus died for us, and in dying for us, he brought me forgiveness and cleansed me from my sins. I believe that Jesus rose from the dead, and in that I have hope of living after I die. I believe that in his teachings, I can learn what the meaning and purpose of my life is, which is to love God above all else and to love other people as I love myself.
Good evening. My name is Ed Hoskins, and I am a physician here at Purdue. I also hold a PhD. In high school, at the International Science and Engineering Fair, I won first place in my division in the world, the equivalent of an Olympic gold medal. But I also had a life-threatening heart condition and was not expected to live very long. At that time, my agnostic and atheistic roots held no satisfying answers to that problem, but the Bible and Jesus did. I put my trust in Christ, and for the last 43 years, I've experienced a life of personal peace and intellectual satisfaction. Thank you.
Francis Bacon, the father of modern science, used to say that there were two books of God, the book of Scripture and the book of nature, otherwise known as the Word of God and the work of God. And Bacon, along with many of the founders of the major subdisciplines of the science, believed that all truth is God's truth. And there was, at the end of the day, no contradiction between those two books, nature and Scripture. If there was any alleged discrepancy or conflict, it really takes place at the level of the interpretation of the facts, the model or interpretation of the facts, be it theology or Scripture, not at the level of the facts themselves. We recognize that theology and science are interpretive abstractions of the data. Not all the sponsors, not all the members of our executive committee putting the symposium together, not all these professors who are confessors are united in agreement on secondary and on tertiary issues. There is dispute, and we've put up a page on our website for people of interest who want to see the top 3 positions in the intramural dialogue and do the homework for themselves on those issues. We don't necessarily agree on these secondary issues with respect to how and when God created. But what we all do affirm with great tenacity is the veracity that God created and what his purpose for us is as displayed in the Bible. We invite you tonight to put down your arms, put down your defenses if you have defenses up, and humbly consider the evidence represented in the title tonight, Putting Creation to the Test, a biblical creation model approach. Ideas have consequences, and some of them have dramatic consequences. Stalin once said that ideas are more powerful than guns. We don't allow our enemies to have guns, so why should we let them have ideas? There are some who want to stifle the free thinking of ideas. And we would like you to just consider the evidence that demands a verdict. We will have two speakers that I'll introduce in turn, and then we would like you to please hold your questions until the Q&A time. Our first speaker is Dr. Hugh Ross. Ross is the founder and president of Reasons to Believe. He has a BS in physics from the University of British Columbia. He earned his MS and PhD in astronomy from the University of Toronto. For several years, he continued his research on quasars and galaxies as a postdoctoral fellow at the California Institute for Technology. In 2012, Dr. Ross, together with Dr. Gerald Schroeder, who is influential in Anthony Fleur's conversion from atheism to theism, received the I.P. Trotter Prize presented by Texas A&M University in recognition of his work in demonstrating connections between science and religion. He is a best-selling author, writing a dozen or so books, and traveling the globe speaking on the compatibility of advancing scientific discoveries with the timeless truths of Christianity. He has spoken on at least 300 university campuses sharing this information. Please welcome with me tonight Dr. Hugh Ross.
Thank you. Well, thank you, and I come to you as a nerd. I mean, I started studying astronomy when I was 7 years of age. I knew from the age of 8 onward that my future career would lie in astrophysics. And it's through my astronomy I recognized that there had to be a beginning to the universe, and it was that recognition that caused me to seek to find the beginner for that beginning. And so for a period of about 2 years, I studied the different philosophies, the religions of the world, and eventually signed my name in the back of a Gideon Bible, giving my life to Jesus Christ. 8 years later, when I arrived on the Caltech campus, I finally got to know Christians. I know they're easy to find here in Indiana, but they're very difficult to find in Canada. But I did find them on the Caltech campus. In fact, I discovered some of the most famous astronomers in the world were committed followers of Jesus Christ. Now, if you go to our table at the back, you'll actually see a summary of the talk you're going to hear from me and Fuzz. So if you want it all condensed into one little tiny card, it's there at the back. And actually, if you fill out the back of that card, we'll give you a free copy of this DVD, Cosmic Fingerprints, where I tell a story of how astrophysics brought me to the Christian faith. And we also include some time where I field questions from skeptics. So that's a free gift just for being here tonight. Now, we are not part of the intelligent design movement. But we've been doing intelligent design a good 10 or 15 years before there was an intelligent design movement. The difference is, in the intelligent design movement, they're simply trying to say that there's an intelligent designer. Our commitment is to build a testable creation model. You may have heard the charge that creationism is not science because it's not testable, it's not falsifiable, it doesn't make predictions of future scientific discoveries. Well, we founded Reasons to Believe 29 years ago with that as a goal, to make it a testable model that is falsifiable, and what you'll see this evening is how successful our model is at predicting future scientific discoveries. Now, the debate is not about design. In fact, if you read the scientific literature, whatever discipline you read, you'll notice that you see the word design everywhere. The issue is who or what is responsible for the design. And this is how we've built our model. We specifically identify the intelligent designer and then build a model around that and then put it to the test and see how well it does. And there's two questions that we need to address in terms of trying to identify this designer. Is the scientific evidence for the creator's existence shrinking or growing as we accumulate more and more information and knowledge about the record of nature? And can we eliminate some or all the alternate explanations? So our goal is not just to establish that God exists, but to identify what kind of God exists. And I think you'll see the scientific evidence is potent enough to help us do that in the 21st century. Now, the first book I ever read on cosmology was one by Fred Hoyle called Nature of the Universe. I read it when I was 7 years of age. And Hoyle comes from a Hindu worldview perspective, but this is what he said in that book. He says, there's a good deal of cosmology in the Bible. It is a remarkable conception. And I remembered that for a course of about 9 or 10 years. When I finally picked up the Bible, I realized he was right. The Bible says more than 10 times as much about the origin and structure of the universe than all the other holy books that undergird the world's religions combined. And there's 4 features of the universe that the Bible repeatedly addresses and addresses in some detail. The first of those is that the universe is traceable back to what we physicists call a singularity beginning, or what you see in the Bible, an actual beginning of space and time. Not just a beginning of matter and energy, but a beginning of space and time itself. And how the universe continuously expands from that point of beginning, and expands under laws of physics that don't change, where one of those laws is a pervasive law of decay. Now, what I'm going to do in the next few minutes is show you explicitly where in the Bible these claims are made, and then what the scientific evidence says about these claims, and what it tells us about Big Bang cosmology. So you're probably familiar with at least a few of the passages that talk about the singularity beginning. Now, I've spoken on 6 continents, and what I notice is no matter where I go, everybody seems to know Genesis 1:1. They may have never heard of John, but they know about Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. What they may not realize, however, is that in the Old Testament Hebrew language, there is no word for universe. Instead, you find this phrase, the Shamayan Eres, the heavens and the earth. And whenever you see that phrase, it means the entirety of all physical reality. You'll see it 9 times in the Old Testament, meaning all of matter, energy, space, and time. And what you'll see in Hebrews 11:3, for example, is the universe that we can detect did not come from that which we can detect. Well, we can detect matter, energy, space, and time. And you've got passages like in Titus and Timothy, which tells us about God's activities before time began. The grace of God that we now experience was put into effect before the beginning of time. The hope that we share in Jesus Christ was given to us before the beginning of time. Now, I was studying the Bible as a teenager at the same time that physicists in Britain were developing the first of what we call the space-time theorems. And I brought the first of those theorems with me here in case you'd like to look at it, the singularities of gravitational collapse in cosmology. It's this paper that launched Stephen Hawking to worldwide fame. And if you're fans of tensor calculus, you won't be able to put this thing down. It's just incredibly fascinating reading. But it ends with a couple of paragraphs that you see up here in the slide I think we can all understand. The power of this theorem is it's based on only 2 basic assumptions. The theorem is true if the universe contains mass. And as I look out at all of you, I see that you're each one of you living evidence that the universe contains mass, a couple of you a little more so than others. The second condition is that the theorem is true if the equations of general relativity reliably describe the movements of bodies in the universe. Now, when I was reading this paper when it was first published, we could only prove the reliability of general relativity to about 1% precision. But today, we know it reliably describes the movements of bodies in the universe to 15 places of the decimal, to better than 1/20% precision. In fact, general relativity now ranks as the most exhaustively tested and best proven principle in all of physics. So there really is no rational basis for doubting that the universe contains mass or that general relativity reliably describes the movements of bodies in the universe, which means that we must accept the conclusion of the paper, namely that the entire universe can be traced back to its space-time beginning, which implies there must be a causal agent beyond space and time that created this universe. Now, that conclusion was not lost on the physics community. There are a number of physicists aware of this theorem who came from a non-theistic perspective, and they spent years of their career trying to find some way to escape the conclusion of the space-time theorem. And there are two in particular, Arvind Borde and Alexander Vilenkin, who devoted 10 years of their theoretical physics career trying to find an escape hatch. And over that 10-year period, they published 5 papers. And it concluded with this paper, their last paper, titled Inflationary Space-Times Are Not Past Incomplete. Now, my wife is an English professor and says they need to get an editor to help them with the titles of their paper. But what they wound up doing is coming up with a far more powerful space-time theorem, which says that any universe that on average expands, what they mean by any universe, it doesn't matter whether they got an inflationary event in the early history or what's happening with the quantum phenomena, any universe that on average expands has a beginning, including a beginning of space and time, thus implying a causal agent beyond space and time that brings the universe into existence. Now, they did find some models of the universe that didn't require this causal agent, but every one of those models would not permit the existence of life. And if you want life, you have to be living in an expanding universe. That's going to any universe that expands. And they wound up concluding that all the universe is subject to the relentless grip of the space-time theorems, which means it really is this causal agent. You can actually read what Alexander Vilenkin is saying about the fact that there is this inescapable space-time beginning implying this agent. What does this mean philosophically? That no longer can scientists presume that all causes are natural. And actually, this means that we need to be open-minded to the possibility that the one that created the greatest miracle of all, I mean, what's happened here is that physicists have actually uncovered evidence for the greatest possible miracle that any scientist could hope to uncover, the coming into existence of all physical reality. And my point is, if that causal agent performed that kind of a dramatic miracle, surely is a possibility that he may choose to intervene at other times, which means from now on, science must be done with an open mind to the possibility that causes we're examining may be natural, they may be supernatural, or a combination of the two. Or to put it another way, some kind of God exists. Lawrence Krauss, probably the most famous atheist scientist living here in America today, wrote a book a few months ago called A Universe from Nothing. If you read carefully the book, what you discover is based on these space-time theorems, he makes a significant concession that one cannot rule out such a deistic view of nature. And so what's happened in the community of physicists and astronomers is a recognition that no longer can we deny deism. Really, the debate has shifted not to whether or not God exists, but whether or not God is a personal being. In fact, if you read the latest books by Stephen Hawking and other atheist physicists, this is really where they're going, is they're trying to deny the existence of a personal creator. So is this God personal, and did he design the universe and the earth for humanity's sake? Now, as much as the Bible says about the beginning of the universe, it actually says more about the expansion of the universe. Now, I not only speak on university campuses, I speak in churches as well, and it's amazing to me how few people in the pews are even aware that the Bible teaches this expansion of the universe. And it's because it's not taught in Genesis. It's not taught in any of the books of Moses. But it is taught in the oldest book of the Bible, namely the book of Job, where it says in the 9th chapter that God alone expands the universe. Now, in most English translations, it comes out that God stretches out the heavens. And these are the various passages in the Bible that speak about the stretching out of the heavens. 6 different Bible authors make this claim. The verb there, natah, often translated stretching out, literally means the expansion of what is being described. Now, I've debated Michael Shermer, the executive director of the Skeptic Society, on 4 different occasions, and this always comes up. And Michael says these passages are simply metaphors or figures of speech. It's not literally speaking about an expanding universe. The reason why he says that is that he recognizes no book of science, no book of philosophy, no book of theology outside the Bible made this claim until the 20th century. So if we recognize that the Bible is talking about a continuous expansion of the universe, it means for thousands of years it was the only book making that claim. Now, what I've pointed out to Michael and others is if you look at these passages, the verb natah shows up in all 3 Hebrew verb forms, cal participle, the cal imperfect, and the cal perfect. As such, it literally is speaking about the expansion of the universe. And it's not just me, a 21st century astronomer, reading this into the text. What happened when we did that Schroeder Prize lecture at Texas A&M, Gerald Schroeder, a Jewish physicist, made the point that Jewish theologians living 800 years ago saw this in the biblical text. So it's not just hindsight. People hundreds of years ago recognized that the Bible was speaking about this expansion of the universe. Now, I've written an entire book, The Creator and the Cosmos, documenting the best scientific evidence that indeed we live in an expanding universe. I don't have time to give you that tonight, but I'll give you a visual demonstration. And it's thanks to the Hubble Space Telescope. And so what you see here is, on one side, galaxies 12 billion light years away, which means it took 12 billion light years for the light to reach us. So we're seeing the galaxies as they were 12 billion years ago. Contrasted with a different part of the sky, we're looking at galaxies 2 billion light years away. So there's 10 billion years of time between these 2 slides. And I've put them at the same spatial scale. So what you see is over the course of those 10 billion years, the galaxies have stretched apart from one another. You also see the galaxies have grown larger as they merge together. Whereas in the first slide, galaxies are jammed so tightly together, they're tearing spiral arms off one another. 10 billion years later, that phenomena virtually doesn't exist. And if we had time, I could show you dozens of Hubble Space Telescope slides that actually show you that over the course of the history of the universe, the galaxies indeed have been spreading apart from one another as a result of the expansion of the universe. And in 7 places in the Bible, it tells us the laws of physics do not change. Jeremiah 33, God is speaking to the Jews and says, "You change, but I don't change. As proof that I don't change, look at the laws that govern the heavens and the earth. As they don't change, I don't change." And you can go to Ecclesiastes and Genesis and Revelation and Romans for additional texts that tell us that we live in a universe where the laws of physics do not change. Romans 8 tells us that one of those laws is a pervasive law of decay, how the entire universe is subject to that pervasive law of decay. Now, as a teenager going through the Bible for the first time, I saw these statements that the Bible was making about the universe and realized it had accurately predicted what we now refer to as Big Bang cosmology. Now, I hear this is an engineering school, so I think a lot of you have probably been exposed to a basic class in thermodynamics. If not, you've probably had an automobile get you to the campus once or twice. And the principle of the automobile engine is that as the piston chamber expands, the temperature goes down. As the piston chamber compresses, the temperature goes up. In fact, with a diesel engine, you don't need a spark plug because the compression becomes so extreme, it's enough to ignite the gasoline. That principle applies to the entire universe, which means that as the universe continuously expands under the principles of thermodynamics, or what the Bible refers to as a pervasive law of decay, which you engineers refer to as a law of entropy, this means that as the universe expands, it must get colder and colder in a highly predictable way. And what I recognized in my teenage years is that what the Bible is saying is a universe expands from a space-time beginning under constant laws of physics, or one of those laws is a pervasive law of decay, that if I know the age of the universe, I actually wind up with a biblically predicted cooling curve of the universe. Now, that was many years ago. What's interesting is that today we got actual measurements to put that to the test. So, for example, here in the next slide, what we have here is the biblically predicted cooling curve for the universe, once we recognize that we know the age of the universe. But overlapping that, you'll see 14 measurements we astronomers have made of the past temperature of the universe. The latest one being the one right there in the middle, where the error bar is so small, it's actually thinner than the width of the line. So very accurately, it's demonstrating that the Bible indeed accurately predicted, thousands of years ago, the precise cooling curve of the universe over its history. So yeah, if you came tonight wanting to see some kind of numerical prediction that the Bible made thousands of years ago that science can put to the test, this is one such example. And today we know what feature is most predominant in governing the expansion of the universe. It's something called dark energy. We thought that it must have existed decades ago, but it wasn't discovered until 1999. And now we know that this dark energy makes up about 3/4 of all the stuff of the universe. And it plays a critical factor in making life possible. Because if you expand the universe too quickly from the cosmic creation event, gravity will not be able to collect any of the gas in the universe to make galaxies, stars, and planets. And there would be no home for living creatures. On the other hand, if dark energy were a little bit weaker than it is, then the universe would expand so slowly that gravity would collect all the gas in the universe and quickly collapse it into nothing but black holes and neutron stars, where the density exceeds 2 billion tons per level teaspoonful. A density so extreme that molecules are impossible, atoms are impossible, even protons and electrons are impossible, and of course life is impossible. But to have the kind of galaxies, stars, and planets that an expanding universe would produce requires fine-tuning this dark energy term to about 1 part in 10 to the 122nd place. 1 in 10 to the 122nd power. Now, there's only 10 to the 79 protons and neutrons in the entire universe, so there's a mind-boggling big number. But let me try to put it in perspective for you. What we're seeing in this fine-tuned design of dark energy is something far greater than the very best example of human creativity, engineering, and design. And as I've thought about that, the best example I can think of in terms of the epitome of human creativity, inventiveness, and design is the LIGO instrument, the gravity wave telescope that was invented by Caltech and MIT physicists and has now been constructed thanks to the generosity of your taxpayer dollars, or at least your parents' taxpayer dollars. This machine is so amazingly fine-tuned, it can make measurements to 1 part in 10 to the 23. But in terms of its comparison with the fine-tuning design of dark energy that makes life possible, it ranks 10 to the 97 times inferior to the level of design and the best example of human creativity. Now, what does that tell us about this causal agent beyond space and time that created our universe? It tells us that the causal agent at a minimum is 10 to the 97 times, or 10 trillion times more intelligent and more knowledgeable than those Caltech and MIT physicists. Now, I've worked with some of these people. They're not stupid people. They're very bright and well-educated, but nothing compared to this causal agent. Or I could put it another way, that this causal agent at a minimum is 10 to the 97 times better funded than the U.S. government that enabled this instrument to be built. Now, I think you're catching my drift here. This causal agent cannot be a non-personal entity, because by definition, intelligence, knowledge, creativity, and power can only be vested in a personal being. So this is establishing that this agent not only transcends space and time, but is also a personal being in the way he has shaped and crafted this dark energy so that life would be possible. Now, likewise, this has not been lost on the community of physicists that take a non-theistic perspective. There were 3 theoretical physicists, all of them atheists, who looked at this dark energy and wound up publishing this paper titled Disturbing Implications of a Cosmological Constant. That's another term for dark energy. And what I'm going to do for you is pull for you 3 quotes from these 3 physicists. They were interviewed by the senior editor of Nature, himself an atheist and a physicist, and what they said in the interview was that arranging the cosmos as we think it is arranged, says the team, would have required a miracle. Now, that kind of got Philip Ball a little excited. You're atheists and you're saying there's this being that's making a miracle. And they went on to say, an unknown agent beyond space and time intervened in the evolution of the universe for reasons of its own, which explains the title of the paper, Disturbing Implications. As atheists, they found it so disturbing that if dark energy is real, there's this causal agent beyond space and time performing miracles for reasons of his own, that they concluded their 21-page paper with this final sentence. Perhaps the only reasonable conclusion is we do not live in a world with a true cosmological constant. Now, the irony of the paper is that it was published just months before we astronomers came up with 9 independent observational demonstrations that not only is dark energy real, it's the dominant component of the universe. And here are 5 of those demonstrations. Here are the other 4. I won't go into the technical details, but if you're interested, I've written an article on all 9 on our reasons.org website. In fact, you can go to that URL there. You'll actually see a list of 25 independent observational demonstrations that we live in a universe where dark energy exists, and not only where dark energy exists, where it is the dominant component of the universe, makes up 3/4 of all the stuff of the universe. What does this mean? It means we really are stuck with an agent beyond space and time who's performing miracles for reasons of his own, miracles that make possible the existence of life in the universe and our existence in particular. Now, if you were to ask me as a scientist, where do we find the most spectacular, measurable evidence for supernatural, superintelligent design, I would say dark energy. But it's not the only piece of evidence. In fact, virtually every feature of the universe that we can measure, every feature of the laws of physics we can measure, shows this extraordinary high level of fine-tuning design. And the only assumption we're bringing to bear here is we're talking about life, we're talking about carbon-based life. My colleague Fazale Rana here, our staff chemist, will tell you that you can only make life based on carbon. All the rest of the elements in the periodic table simply don't permit the bonding stability or the bonding complexity to make life possible. I don't care how many eyes the creature has, just that it's carbon-based. And so, for example, we discovered that all 4 of the forces of physics must be extraordinarily fine-tuned. For example, if you want life, it's crucial that we fine-tune the ratio of the force of gravity relative to the force of electromagnetism to within 1 part in 10,000 trillion trillion trillion. If that's not the case, stars will either never form or they form and they immediately explode. Either way, there's no possibility for life. And the list goes on. You have to fine-tune the velocity of light. It's important that the universe have the same number of protons as it has electrons to within 1 part in 10 to the 37. The entropy must be fine-tuned. The cosmic expansion rate must be fine-tuned to better than 1 part in 10 to the 56. And we became cognizant of this in 1991. And so starting in 1991, we would survey the scientific literature and count up how many features of the universe and the laws of physics demonstrate this extraordinary level, high level of fine-tuning design. And what we discovered is the list has been growing with respect to time. Now, this is the testing principle. if we really are looking at the God of the Bible as being responsible for all of this, then the more we learn from the record of nature, the more evidence we should be accumulating for this fine-tuning design. And so what we have here is a table that shows us how that fine-tuning design has accumulated over the past 20 years, where we've gone from 17 different features of the universe and the laws of physics that show this very high level of fine-tuning design, where the list now stands above 180. And if you want to see the documentation, you can go to that URL, reasons.org/fine-tuning. That will pop up a 300-page compendium that lists the evidence and then gives the citations to the scientific literature. And if you want something a little briefer than that 300-page compendium, here's a one-sentence summary from the book of Hebrews. The heavens are the work of your hands. Or you can go to the bookstore here. If you're to go to the bookstore, I'm guessing you'll find several dozen different titles and what is termed the anthropic principle. This is the idea that we live in a universe where the universe is designed or fine-tuned to make possible the existence of life and human beings in particular. But as I've looked at those books, they typically stop at the level of the universe. Now, if we really are seeing this as the handiwork of the God of the Bible, we would expect that we would see evidence that would extend beyond just the universe as a whole. And so that's been a large part of our research at Reasons to Believe, is to see if we see the same signature for supernatural design, not just at the level of the universe, but at the level of our cluster of galaxies, or the galaxy within our cluster. In fact, we've been able to document that there's over 200 different features of our Milky Way galaxy that must be fine-tuned to make possible the existence of advanced life. And that's what spoiled my enjoyment for the Star Wars series. As soon as the thing went up, a galaxy far, far away. Hey, we've looked far, far away. The only galaxy that we see is our own that has the characteristics that would make life possible. And you need a just right star, a just right Jupiter, a just right Saturn. In fact, we now know, thanks to the discovery of planets outside of our solar system, that every planet in our solar system plays a critical role in making advanced life possible here on planet Earth. So when Thanksgiving Day comes around, I'd like to encourage you to thank God, not just for your dinner, but to thank God for Neptune, for Uranus, for Mars, for Venus. Because every one of those planets makes it possible for you to enjoy your Thanksgiving dinner. You need every one of them. And of course, hundreds of features of the Earth must be fine-tuned, and over 20 different features of our moon must be fine-tuned to make advanced life possible here on planet Earth. If you're not living on a small rocky planet orbited by a gigantic single moon, your rotation axis will not be stabilized. The rest of the planets do this with their rotation axis. Ours remains stable thanks to the moon, and the moon is also responsible for giving us the tidal friction that makes possible the great diversity of life on the planet and the rotation period we need for advanced life. Now, the difference here compared to the universe, we can only measure one universe. If God made 3 universes, we'll never know, because once you've got observers in universe A, its space-time manifold can't overlap that of any other possibly existing universe. So we astronomers are stuck with a sample size of 1 when it comes to the universe. When we look at galaxies and stars, we now have a sample size in the hundreds of billions. And this makes possible statistical tests that are not possible with the universe. And this is how it works, for example. If no creator is responsible for this design evidence we're seeing, then we would anticipate that the more we learn about our galaxy and other galaxies and our solar system and other planetary systems, that these design evidences would decrease, both in the number of features and in the degree of fine-tuning that we measure there. And hence that the evidence for the biblical God as a designer would get progressively weaker and weaker as we learn more and more. But if we are talking the God of the Bible, we would predict the exact opposite. And this is what's important in terms of scientific testing, to come up with predictions that are polar opposites with one another, because then you can go out and make the observations, do the experiments, and see which model is correct. Now, we began doing this study back in 1995. And in 1995, as we went through the scientific literature, we found 41 different features of our galaxy and our planetary system that had to be fine-tuned to make life possible. And I took a course from Carl Sagan when I was at the University of Toronto. He loved to talk about the billions and billions, and he was the one that came up with the most optimistic estimate for how many planets might exist within the universe, namely 100 billion trillion. So I use that number. I think that number is optimistic, but I'm willing to use this number. And we also carefully calculate the dependency factors on these 41 features. But this is what we came up with. Taking into account the dependency factors and the maximum number of planets, the probability was less than 1 chance in 10 to the 31st power that all 41 features would be met in a single body within the universe without invoking divine miraculous intervention. That was 1995. We've been continuing to watch this in the scientific literature since that date, and this is the table that you can see that shows how the probability has gotten progressively more remote. Instead of 41 features, we're now looking at 676. And by the way, this is not for human life. This is just to get bacteria that can remain on the planet for several million years. So now less than 1 chance in 10 to the 556 power. You say, what does it look like if we go for more advanced life like plants and animals? Well, you can see that in the compendium we've got on our website. And the probability drops to less than 1 chance in 1 chance in 10 to the 1,050th power. So we're now talking 1,050 zeros after the 1. You say, can you kind of put that in layman's language? Well, it's roughly equivalent to winning the California lottery 150 consecutive times, where you buy just 1 ticket each time. Or as a mathematician friend of mine said, it's the same probability of winning the California lottery 150 consecutive times where you don't buy any tickets at all. So, but what I want you to notice is how rapidly the evidence is accumulating for a supernatural, superintelligent designer. If you look at that last column, the evidence gets roughly a factor of 1 million times stronger every month. Literally every month, we're adding an average of 6 zeros, which means I can say to a skeptic, if you're not convinced today, wait a month and see what happens within the next month. And if you want to follow us, both Fuzz and I have a Twitter account where we actually try to help you stay on top of the scientific papers that are giving you the accumulating evidence for this supernatural, superintelligent design. But again, if you want a 1-sentence summary instead of the 300 pages, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. Or if you want a quote from a physicist who's not a believer, Freeman Dyson said this in Disturbing the Universe. The more I examine the universe, the more evidence I find. Let me pull this back for you. Okay. This clicker's not working. The more I examine the universe, the more evidence I find that the universe, in some sense, must have known we were coming. And this is something my peers really don't dispute anymore, that when you look at the universe, it's clear that it was prepared in advance for the entry of human beings. It was designed in advance for us to show here. Now, you're hearing me address you as a Christian. What we're making available to you outside is a debate that we had on this subject where it was me and Victor Stenger, a lifelong atheist and a particle physicist. And this would happen at the International Skeptic Society Conference where they had 700 atheists from around the world gather at Caltech. And the conference was weekend. They had 6 speakers, all scientists giving evidence for why God doesn't exist. And at the very end, they had me come up and debate Victor Stenger on this subject. And they called it the Great Debate. That's not our title. That's the title the Skeptic Society put on it. They sell it for $30, but we're selling it outside there for $5 because we want you to see how well this evidence stands up when it's presented before a highly educated, very hostile audience. And you need to listen carefully to the last words. They give Victor Stenger the last word. And by the way, it's a whole debate. He speaks, I speak. We talk together and engage one another. Then there's a long Q&A with the rest of the speakers. And at the very end, they give Victor Stenger the last word. Listen carefully to what he says. You'll be amazed. All right. You can also read a book on this that I've written, Why the Universe is the Way It Is. And as I mentioned, both Fuzz and I maintain Twitter and Facebook accounts where we try to keep you up to date. What I want to close is with a brief statement about design that I don't think has gotten proper attention. There's been a lot of attention on how the physics and the chemistry of the universe, our galaxy, our solar system, our Earth, our moon, are all very carefully fine-tuned to make possible our existence. It's also very carefully fine-tuned to enable us to do science. And so one of the things we astronomers have discovered is that we're living at a very special time in the history of the universe where we can actually observe the history of the universe. Namely, that if we were created any earlier than about 14 billion years after the cosmic creation event, light from the cosmic creation event would not have adequate time to travel on the space surface of the universe and reach our telescope. On the other hand, because of dark energy is a feature that expands the universe at a more and more rapid rate as time goes on. Right now, we're living at a time in the history of the universe where dark energy is expanding the farthest reaches of the space surface of the universe at barely under the velocity of light. It won't be long on an astronomical time scale before dark energy expands that surface at greater than the velocity of light. What does that mean? The light will never get to our telescope. So, for example, if we were put here, say, 4 or 5 billion years ago, we'd only be seeing the last 2/3 of the history of the universe. Or if we were put here 4.5 billion years in the future, again, we'd only be seeing the last 2/3 of the history of the universe. We're living at the one epoch in the history of the universe where we get to read the whole storybook of the universe and actually look all the way back to the very beginning of the universe. You say, how close can we get? Well, I can actually show you an image of the universe when the universe is a trillionth of a trillionth of a trillionth of a second old. And it's our ability as astronomers to directly witness the cosmic creation event where we get some of the most compelling evidence that there must be a creator beyond space and time that personally designed the universe for the benefit of life, and we human beings in particular. Now, I've given a whole presentation like this in front of an audience of physicists and astronomers, just focusing on this very point that we're at this unique time when we can actually do astronomy and actually get astronomical observations from the entire history of the universe. And many of them will say, well, I think that's just a coincidence that we happen to be here at the one time where we can see everything. But something else we notice, we're not just at the right time, we're also in a unique location. Now, we're in a location about halfway out from the center of our galaxy. And because we're halfway out from the center of the galaxy, our night sky is dark enough where we can see all the galaxies in the universe and the cosmic background radiation from the cosmic creation event. If we were any closer to the center of our galaxy, the night sky would be too bright. And likewise, we're now in between two spiral arms. We cross the spiral arm about once every billion years. But the last time we crossed was just before the Cambrian explosion of animal life. And right now we're halfway between the Sagittarius and Perseus spiral arms. The spiral arms are really bright, but because we're halfway in between, the night sky is dark enough that we can see distant galaxies. And a unique feature of our Milky Way galaxy is that what sustains the spiral structure is star formation. Stars form in gaseous nebulae. Those are little pink spots you see all around the spiral arms. Those are the maternity wards of our galaxy. But what's unique about our Milky Way galaxy is how many maternity wards we have. We have literally hundreds, and they're all tiny. If you look at other spiral galaxies, the galaxies are dominated by really big gaseous nebulae. But that's not the case for us. They're all small. And the closest one is 1,500 light years away. So far away we can barely see it with a naked eye. And it's really the only one we can see with a naked eye. which means we have a night sky that's dark enough. And the other thing we notice is that we live in an unusual cluster of galaxies. Now, for life to be possible, you have to live in a cluster of galaxies. That's crucial to sustain the spiral structure. But most clusters of galaxies have thousands of members. Our cluster has only 100 members. And all the rest of the clusters are dominated by giant galaxies. Our cluster doesn't have any giant galaxies. It's got 2 large galaxies and the rest are dwarfs. And in other clusters, the galaxies are jammed tightly together. In ours, the galaxies are far apart. Far enough apart, with no giant galaxies, that we can actually see very distant galaxies and even the cosmic creation event radiation. Now, some of you might be listening to what I'm going to say and Fuzz is going to say and say, isn't this evidence God of the gaps? I get that all the time when I speak on university campuses. Well, there's always gaps. And what's happening here, people are saying, I will not believe until all the gaps are closed. Well, that'll never happen. We're never going to learn everything. But we can use the gaps as a test. The test is what happens to the gaps as we learn more and more. Do the gaps get bigger and more problematic, or do they get smaller and less problematic? And there's a nature of the gaps. Do the naturalistic explanatory gaps get more or less numerous, bigger or smaller, more or less problematic, as scientists learn more and more about the record of nature? Now, I've addressed the physical sciences. Fuzz here is going to be addressing the biological sciences, but the conclusion we're going to be drawing is that for fine-tuning the origins of the universe, the origin of Earth, the origin of life, and the origin of human beings, the theism gaps are shrinking, while the naturalism gaps are getting bigger and getting dramatically bigger as we learn more and more about the origin of life, the origin of the universe, the origin of humanity, and the fine-tuning. Again, don't remember to pick up your free copy of Cosmic Fingerprints. Thank you.
Wow, huh? It brings to relief one of the statements that famous atheist philosopher that I used to read as a young grad student, Anthony Flew, before his conversion to theism or some kind of Aristotelian deism, made. He used to adopt a presumption of atheism. He used to say things like, as scientists, we ought to operate with the presumption that atheism is true. We ought to start from a methodology of naturalism. But seeing this and the gaps growing on the other side, one wonders, why not have an open view of science? Be open to follow the evidence where it leads. When asked what he thought Bertrand Russell, the famous atheist who wrote Why I Am Not a Christian, when asked what he thought Russell would say, given the new evidence that Flew has come to understand, he said, I think Russell would want to re-examine his position. Flew's statements in his book prior to his death says that, I now believe that the universe was brought into existence by an infinite intelligence. If the evidence that is available today were available when I started my career may have ended up on a different trajectory entirely. In the philosophical world, he's sort of like equivalent to a Stephen Hawking, maybe not that high, but significant. He also says, I believe that life and reproduction originate in a divine source. With that, we now turn into another direction, from the origin of the universe to the origin of life. Our second major speaker is Dr. Fazale Rana, otherwise known as Fuzz. Fuzz is a former Muslim. He became a Christian in graduate school while studying biochemistry. The cell's complexity and sophistication, together with the inadequacy of evolutionary scenarios to account for life's origin, compelled him to conclude that it must have begun by a creator. And as he read through the Sermon on the Mount, he became convinced that Jesus is who the Christians have claimed that he is: Kurios, Lord, Master. Formerly a senior research scientist at Procter & Gamble, Fuzz is the vice president of research and apologetics at Reasons to Believe. He graduated with highest honors from West Virginia State University with a BS in chemistry and went on to earn a PhD in chemistry with emphasis in biochemistry from Ohio University, where he was twice awarded the Donald Clippinger Research Award. Dr. Rana did postdoc research on cellular membranes at the universities of Georgia and Virginia. In addition to his many publications in scientific peer-reviewed journals, he has written several books and spoken at a few hundred universities. Please welcome with me Dr. Fazale Rana.
Okay, well, good evening, everybody. If you just give us a second, we're going to switch computers real quickly. Oops. We, a few months ago, brought in a speaking coach at Reasons to Believe to help the speakers do a better job when we go out and talk. And what we're doing right now is considered the #1 cardinal sin of speaking, is you're never supposed to fiddle with your technology. You're supposed to make the connection with the audience and then fiddle with your technology, but I just can't do that, so... So nobody tell our speaking coach what I'm doing right now. Let's see here. All right. Okay. How are we doing? All right. Well, anyway, now's my attempt to connect with the audience. It's really an honor and a privilege to be part of this year's symposium here at Purdue University, and this is the first time I've been on the Purdue University campus. So I'm really enjoying just getting to know Purdue a little bit. And when I think of Purdue University, I think of two things. And one of them is not Drew Brees. Well, actually, it is Drew Brees. So I think of three things when I think of Purdue. Drew Brees. And then the second thing is the time that I spent at Procter & Gamble. Prior to joining Reasons to Believe, I spent about 7.5 years working at Procter & Gamble in research and development. And Purdue University was one of the universities we deliberately targeted to recruit engineers and scientists. So I worked alongside a lot of Purdue alumni and had very much respect and admiration for them. So that's really a testament to the fine university that Purdue is. And then the next thing that I think about is my freshman chemistry class, the second semester of freshman chemistry, when we were being introduced to chemical bonding. And there I learned about a chemist named H.C. Brown. Do any of you guys know who Herbert Brown is? Yeah. Well, a Nobel laureate, right, from Purdue University. And Brown pioneered work in borane chemistry, not boring chemistry, the type that keeps you asleep during lectures. Borane chemistry, which are compounds derived from the element boron. And these compounds consist of boron and hydrogen, and they have very unusual bonding properties. At least certain boranes have unusual bonding properties. And H.C. Brown discovered what's known as the 3-center 2-electron bond. And this is really kind of interesting because in a typical covalent bond, you have two atoms that share a pair of electrons. That's a 2-center 2-electron bond. That's the standard covalent bond. But Brown discovered that there's actually bonding that can take place with 3 atoms sharing 2 electrons. And that's a pretty interesting thing. And this was the first time as a young student of science that I began to appreciate something very important about science. Of course, science is about discovering patterns and regularity and things like that in nature, the orderliness of nature, and that's very important. That's how you make predictions about what's going to happen The next time you do an experiment, that's how you are able to develop technology and able to engage in engineering, because there are regularities, because there are patterns in nature. But I learned through studying the work of H.C. Brown that science can also be about discovering that which is exceptional, that which is unusual, that which is unexpected. And in fact, that's probably even more interesting when you think about science than discovering those things that behave in an orderly manner. And in a sense, tonight, what you're being presented with is something that I think is exceptional, is unusual, is unexpected. And that is the idea that the biblical text can actually serve as a source of information about the way nature is structured. We live in a culture where the common narrative is that there is a conflict between science and faith. Most people are familiar with that idea, that narrative. But also, there's a counter-narrative that's pretty commonplace, and that is there's harmony between science and the Christian faith. And most people are familiar with that. But I think very few people are actually familiar with the notion that, again, you can use the biblical text to actually derive information about the way nature is structured, and that you can then put those ideas to the test through scientific investigation. And that's what Hugh was talking about in his presentation, and I want to continue in that vein by looking at the life sciences in light of our creation model. Now, this is an expansive area, and we could spend days and days talking about the life sciences in light of our creation model. And so there's really two choices I have. One is to just simply do a survey, or the other is to focus in a particular area. And tonight I've decided just to focus on the origin of life question, in part because tomorrow morning Hugh's going to be talking about Genesis 1 and its relationship to the scientific record, and you'll be getting a survey of our creation model, not only for the life sciences, but really for earth sciences and the life science. So there's no reason to duplicate that tonight. And then tomorrow afternoon, I'm going to be focusing on the origin of humanity specifically in light of our creation model. So the odd man out is the origin of life question, so that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. And what I'm going to be doing in my presentation this evening is, before I get into our creation model for the origin of life, is talk a little bit about the way in which people react to this idea of a creation model. I'm going to expose you to two commonplace objections that people raise when we attempt to do this kind of work, and then we'll go into building the creation model for the origin of life and then evaluating it in light of the scientific evidence. And the first objection that we see is this one, that you can't put God in a test tube. Every time Hugh and I go on a campus and speak about our creation model, this is an objection that immediately is raised by scientists. And this objection can be better appreciated by examining a passage from a book called The Triumph of Evolution and the Failure of Creationism, written by Niles Eldredge. I don't know if you're familiar with who Niles Eldredge is. He's a paleontologist at the American Museum of Natural History. He, along with Stephen Jay Gould, advanced the idea known as punctuated equilibrium about the mode and the tempo of evolutionary history from the fossil record. And he also is an advocate for evolution as an evolution education, if you will. And wrote a book about 15 years ago now called The Triumph of Evolution and the Failure of Creationism. It's a dated book, but his point here is actually very nicely stated and is relevant and representative of what many in the scientific community say about the idea of, again, evoking a creation model. And this is what Eldredge says: "We humans can directly experience the material world only through our senses, and there's no way we can directly experience the supernatural. Thus, in the enterprise that is science, it isn't an ontological claim that a God does not exist, but rather an epistemological recognition that even if such a God did exist, there would be no way to experience that God given the impressive but still limited means afforded by science, and that is true by definition." So very nicely stated on the part of Eldredge, but I don't agree with what he is saying there. And the reason why I don't agree with that is because science is actually capable of detecting the work of intelligent agency. For example, forensic science, the science of crime scene investigation, is capable of determining whether or not a dead person died through natural causes or through foul play, that is, through the work of an intelligent agent. Or when you go into the area of archaeology and anthropology, scientists are very good at picking up rocks and determining whether that rock was actually formed into a stone tool by some hominin or whether or not it was actually shaped that way through natural processes. And in fact, scientists can even tell you something about the capabilities of that hominin that shaped that particular stone tool. So science can detect the work of intelligent agency, in spite of, again, what Eldridge and others would claim. And then finally, there's SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. That whole enterprise is predicated on the ability to determine whether or not electromagnetic radiation is emanating deliberately from an intelligent civilization or whether or not it's due to some kind of natural process phenomena. So science can detect the work of intelligent agency. And so as a Christian, I believe God is revealed through the record of nature, and that his fingerprints are in the creation. And so if God is an intelligent agent, a personal being, which I believe he is, then we should be able to detect scientifically evidence for God's fingerprints in nature. And that is not a violation of the scientific enterprise. Another complaint that we get is that you can't use a religious text to develop a scientific model. Scientists become very offended at this idea of using, again, a religious text towards this end. Well, I would call your attention to the work of the German chemist Kekulé in response to this legitimate concern. Friedrich Kekulé is known for discovering the structure or determining the structure of benzene. And this was in the 1830s, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. And at that time, nobody knew what the structure of benzene was. We knew what the chemical composition was. It was C6H6, but nobody knew what the structure of benzene was. And Kekulé, according to the stories that he would recount, fell asleep and had a dream of a snake biting its tail, and from that had the inspiration that maybe benzene was a ringed compound. And it turns out that he was correct, and in fact discovered along the way another exceptional form of bonding, and that is a type of bonding known as aromaticity, which is very, very important in understanding the structure of many organic compounds. But the point here is this, is that Kekulé had a dream, and based on that dream proposed a scientific theory. Okay? And it doesn't really matter, would be my point, where the scientific theory comes from, as long as that once you have that theory in place, you subject it to the rigors of scientific testing, which is what Kekulé did, and to great success. And that's what we're attempting to do here tonight, is that very type of an approach. Okay, without further ado, let's go ahead and build the creation model for the origin of life. Now, I'm going to very quickly review some things that Hugh alluded to in his presentation, but maybe give them a little bit more formal structure, and that is to describe the process by which we go through to build the creation model. And you can think of the 3 I's, if you will. We identify the passages in Scripture that speak about a particular aspect of God's creative work. In this case, passages that would deal with the origin of life. We then interpret those passages within the context that they're found and then integrate them into a coherent framework that describes God's creative work and then recast them in the form of a scientific model. And if you're a philosopher of science, specifically what we're developing is a descriptive historical model. And then that model has logical implications that constitute the tests for the model, that constitute the predictions that we can use to evaluate the model and either falsify it or affirm it. And then finally, this approach is very much part of, again, a scientific process because these predictions and the nature of the model is going to suggest future scientific directions for investigation. Now, the details of this work are found in 3 books, Origins of Life, The Cell's Design, and creating life in the lab, which form kind of an origin of life trilogy. And the point here of showing you this is, number one, making sure you know where you can go if you want to dig deeper into this particular question, but also to point out that this work represents about 10 years of writing effort and even additional years of research effort. And so this is not something that we've done lightly, but this is actually something that we've spent a significant amount of effort working on in terms of developing and elaborating this model for the origin of life. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at how we build the models in specific terms. The key passage for our origin of life model would be Genesis 1:2. And I'll explain to you why we think this is relevant to the origin of life in just a minute. But this passage is, in my opinion, one of the most remarkable passages in Scripture. It follows, of course, after Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God creates the heavens and the earth, which Hugh talked about in his presentation. This is now giving us a picture of the earth in its primordial state. So there's an intervening period of time between the creation of the universe and the earth in its primordial state that the biblical text, at least in the context of Genesis 1, is silent about. And this is giving us a picture of the early earth, which we believe to be the setting or the backdrop for the origin of life. It says the earth was formless and empty, darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. So again, this is a picture of the early earth, and this particular passage is echoed in other creation accounts like Psalm 104. Psalm 104 is a creation psalm that echoes Genesis 1, where different portions of the psalm correspond to different days of creation in Genesis 1, and verses 5 and 6 correspond to Genesis 1:2. And this says here, He set the earth on its foundation. It can never be moved. You covered it with the deep as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. So again, this is giving us a different perspective on the early earth in its primordial state, and is giving us some temporal information. Genesis 1:2 is telling us that the earth was a water world, that darkness enshrouded the planet, and this is telling us that the rocky materials of the earth, the foundations, were established first, and then water and the earth's oceans were covering the planet as a secondary feature. Job 38 is another creation account, actually Job 38 through 41, that again corresponds to Genesis 1. And this particular portion that we're going to look at, verses 4 through 11, are in reference to the early earth, but is giving us information about the source of the darkness on the planet's surface. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? On what were its footings set? Or who laid its cornerstone while the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy? Who shut up the sea behind doors when it burst forth from the womb? When I made the clouds its garment and wrapped it in a thick darkness, when I fixed limits for it and set its doors and bars in place, when I said, this far you may come and no further, here's where your proud waves halt. So these are the passages in Scripture that we would point to give us an understanding of, again, the setting or the backdrop for the origin of life. And this is giving us a depiction of the earth in its primordial state. So what can we conclude from this? Well, as Hugh will talk about more tomorrow, the frame of reference for these passages would be as if you were a hypothetical observer residing on the surface of the earth, because the Spirit of God is hovering over the waters. So as a hypothetical observer on the surface of the earth, you would see darkness everywhere, and based on Job 38, verses 4 through 11, we would understand that darkness to be caused by cloud cover, by a thick atmosphere. We would also understand from Psalm 104 that the rocky material was formed first, and then the oceans became permanent features in a secondary sense. And of course, the earth is a water world based on Psalm 104 as well as Genesis 1:2. Now, in Genesis 1:2, it tells us that the earth is formless and empty. And this is a very difficult phrase to translate from Hebrew into English. In Hebrew, it's tohu vabohu, and this phrase carries with it the connotation of desolation. For example, in Deuteronomy 32, that expression is translated as howling waste. In Jeremiah 4 and Isaiah 45, it's translated as an uninhabited wasteland. And the Hebrew scholar Victor Hamilton, in his commentary on Genesis, translates that expression this way: and the earth, it was a desert, and it was a wasteland. And so this is telling us that in addition to being a water world where there was darkness everywhere, the earth in its early state was a hostile environment, a harsh, hostile environment. Now, how do we get the origin of life out of Genesis 1:2? I don't think the passage is directly making a statement about God creating the origin of life, but it's really an implication or an inference that we're drawing from the text. And the key phrase here would be the Spirit of God hovering over the waters. And in the original Hebrew, the word that's translated as hovering, rahap, is only used one other time, and that's in Deuteronomy 32, verses 9 through 12. Deuteronomy 32 is called the Song of Moses. This is a passage that's describing a psalm that Moses wrote in celebration of the fact that Israel is about to go into the Promised Land. And so Moses is remembering all of the things that God has done for the nation of Israel. And here he's talking about the nation of Israel wandering through the desert and God being there to protect the nation of Israel in a harsh, hostile environment. The Lord's portion is his people, Jacob his allotted inheritance. In a desert land, he found him in a barren and howling waste. There's that expression, tohu wabohu. He shielded him and cared for him, like an eagle that stirs up its nest and hovers over its young, that spreads its wings to catch them and carries them on its pinions. The Lord alone led him. No foreign god was with him. When Moses wrote these words, most biblical commentators will tell you that he had Genesis 1:2 in mind, that it's the same imagery, and that this is indicating that in Genesis 1:2, when the Spirit of God is hovering over the waters, that there is something special that the Spirit of God is protecting, that the Spirit of God is guarding. And so we propose that maybe this very well may be the seeds of life or the very first life on the earth, and therefore would be in reference to an origin of life event. So from that, we can develop a set of predictions. And these are just a few broad brush predictions that flow from this analysis. The first is that life should appear early in Earth's history if you're looking at Earth in a primordial state. That life should appear under hostile conditions. And that we would argue that life should appear suddenly. If it's an act of creation, then you'd expect it to appear suddenly. And then finally, we would argue that life in its minimal form should be biochemically complex and should show evidence for design. These two predictions don't follow out of Genesis 1:2, but again are reasonable predictions that one would make if you're adopting a design framework. Okay, now let's turn our attention to the scientific record. And let's take a look at the conditions of the early Earth, which again are the backdrop or the setting for the origin of life and are described in Genesis 1:2 and Psalm 104 and Job 38. Well, the first thing is that when the earth forms, if you were a hypothetical observer on the surface of the earth, it really would be a planet of darkness, enshrouded in darkness, because of, number one, the thick primordial atmosphere of the earth, but also the interplanetary debris, which would prevent sunlight from reaching the surface of the earth. So Genesis 1:2 is correct on that account. In addition to that, when we look at the history of the early earth, we recognize it as a harsh, hostile environment where initially you would have had only rocky material defining the planet. There wouldn't be any kind of oceans or water on the surface of the planet because of the extreme heat on the surface of the planet where it was a molten planet, in part because of the gravitational energy that would be liberated when the planetesimals accrete to form the planet. There's also high level of radioactive isotopes. That radioactive decay would liberate heat that, again, would keep the planet in a molten state. And the Earth was experiencing impactors. And there are 4 stages to the impact history of Earth. The first would be the moon-forming impact, where an object about the size of Mars hits the Earth and spews debris into the orbit of the Earth that coalesces to form the moon. Then after that, you would have basically a phase of asteroidal and cometary impacts that go from about, again, 4.5 billion years to about 4 billion years, where the frequency and the size of the impactors would gradually tail off. Then there is a late heavy bombardment at about 3.9 billion years ago, where a gravitational perturbation in the solar system causes a second wave of asteroids and comets to pummel the Earth. And then there's going to be an impact tail as those impactors decrease in size and frequency. So that's the impact history, but clearly the Earth is, again, a harsh, hostile environment, and through most of this window of time, it's hard to envision there being water on the surface of the Earth, at least as a permanent feature. And it's really not until after the late heavy bombardment concludes that oceans can become a permanent feature on the planet. Now, nobody really knows where the water comes from, by the way. The latest idea is that it may very well represent outgassing from the planetesimals, although there's still this idea that cometary delivery is responsible for the water. Nevertheless, the oceans are, again, a permanent feature on the planet, but a secondary feature after the rocky material forms, which again is an accurate depiction presented in the biblical texts. Okay, and then finally, one point just to be complete, and that is that there is a changing view for when oceans became a permanent feature on the Earth. There are these zircon crystals that have been uncovered in rocks that date at 3.8 billion years in age, but these crystals actually date themselves to between 4.2 and 4.4 billion years. So these actually survived the late heavy bombardment, but the oxygen isotope distribution in the crystals suggests that they were formed under wet conditions, which are leading some scientists to suggest that maybe there were oceans present on the Earth prior to the late heavy bombardment. So anyway, here's a diagram kind of showing the impact history of the early Earth. And you can see that, again, there's the moon-forming impact, and then you have this decreasing wave of impactors. Maybe there was a cool Earth with oceans. There's a late heavy bombardment that takes place. So again, this is giving us a picture of the Earth consistent with Genesis 1:2 in that it was a harsh, hostile environment. Now, what's actually remarkable is the fact that this is where the evidence indicates that life first appears on the planet, at about 3.8 billion years ago. So as the Earth is exiting the late heavy bombardment under these harsh, hostile conditions, we see evidence that life appears, again, on Earth very early in its history under hostile conditions, which is counterintuitive. This is a prediction made by our model, but this is actually counterintuitive. You would not think that life should be able to exist. Now, if life appears immediately after the late heavy bombardment, and many people think the late heavy bombardment was a sterilization event, meaning that if there was any life present on the Earth, it would have been obliterated through the late heavy bombardment. And as a result of that, you really need to think about the origin of life process beginning, the t equals 0, at about 3.8 billion years ago, which means life seems to emerge virtually instantaneously on the Earth under harsh, hostile conditions. Now, what is the evidence for life appearing that early in Earth's history? Well, it's found in rock formations in western Greenland, where we have a number of different geochemical markers that indicate that there was biological activity on the planet. And these markers suggest the possibility that these very first life forms were capable of engaging in photosynthetic activity, which is rather astonishing because photosynthesis is one of the most complex metabolic processes that we are aware of. So these would be likely microorganisms, bacteria and archaea, but they would have already possessed the capability of complex metabolism very, very early on. In addition to that evidence, we have also geochemical evidence in rock formations that date in the 3.2 to 3.5 billion year range found in Western Australia and in South Africa. And these are also geochemical markers that, again, are suggestive of biological activity. But in addition to that, in these particular rock formations, which have escaped metamorphosis, we actually see fossil evidence that is preserved. And this is in the form of macroscopic fossils like stromatolites and microbial mats, which are, again, structures produced by microorganisms. And these structures are produced by complex ecosystems of microbes. So this is implying, again, an ecological complexity on the early Earth. We also have evidence for microfossils, fossilized bacteria, as well as what are called microtubules, which are structures that are produced by bacteria that are capable of eating rocks, basically, rock-eating microbes. This is what Niles Aldrich has said with regard to the discovery of life appearing that early in Earth's history. One of the most arresting facts I've ever learned is that life goes back as far in Earth's history as we can possibly trace it. In other words, in the very oldest rocks that stand a chance of showing signs of life, we find those signs, those vestiges of life. Life is intrinsic to the Earth. And so again, the idea that this is an arresting fact means that it's counterintuitive. It's not what you'd expect given the standard story for how life originates, but yet it's something that our creation model actually predicts. Now, in addition to recognizing the existence of microbial life on the early Earth, we can actually get some understanding from the geochemical and the fossil record as to what these very first life forms were like. And the geochemical markers that we see are consistent with a number of different types of metabolic processes, which includes not only photosynthesis, but methanogenesis, methanotrophism, sulfate reduction, and sulfur disproportionation. So it looks like there is a wide range of metabolic lifestyles that are present very early in Earth's history, suggesting, again, a complex ecosystem of microorganisms. In addition to that, just simple reason, if you understand anything about life and how biochemistry works, these organisms are going to have to be able to replicate. They're going to have to be able to produce cell walls and DNA and protein. They're going to have to be able to not only harvest energy, but again, produce building block materials. So these are going to be, by definition, complex metabolic entities. And in fact, this is what Bill Schaaf, one of the world's leading authorities in early life on Earth, has said about these very first organisms. In his book, The Cradle of Life, Bill Schaaf says this: "No one has publicly disagreed with my interpretation of the apex fossils." These would be a term used to describe the microfossils that are found in the rock formations in western Greenland. Privately, some would prefer that I was mistaken, since they and I too would prefer a simpler evolutionary story, one that told us these oldest fossil organisms were capable only of primitive ways of living, and that advanced metabolic lifestyles evolved much later. But the evidence seems strong, and what one might prefer shouldn't matter. So again, this is a counterintuitive discovery, but it's something that our model predicts. Now, there's another way that we can get at what the chemical complexity of these very first life forms are like, and that is by actually turning our attention to an area of biochemistry known as genomics. This is an area where the goal is to sequence the entire genetic makeup of an organism. That's referred to as its genome. And it turns out that genome size is actually a very nice proxy for chemical complexity of an organism, for its biochemical complexity. And the reason is because the genomes contain the information needed to make molecules that are known as proteins. And proteins are the workhorse molecules of life. They're responsible for carrying out every activity that's taking place inside the cell that's necessary for life. And so if you know what proteins are present and how many different types of proteins are, you have a good understanding of the organism's biology, but you also have a good understanding of its complexity. And so you can measure genome size in the form of gene numbers, or the number of gene products. And the idea here is that within DNA, there are regions of the DNA that harbor the information needed to make specific protein chains. And those regions are called genes. So the number of gene products, or the number of genes, corresponds roughly to the number of proteins. And that, again, gives you an estimate of complexity. And so in recent years, the genomes of microorganisms have been sequenced almost on a routine basis now. And if you just simply survey the database of microbial genomes and look for the smallest genome sizes that you can find, for example, for extremophiles, these are microorganisms that can live under very harsh conditions that many people think are representatives for what the very first microorganisms on Earth looked like. You see that that survey indicates that the minimum genome size is approximately about 1,500 gene products in size. This would be for an organism that could live independently in its environment. And again, that level of complexity corresponds to what we would infer the complexity to be from the geochemical and the fossil record. Photosynthetic bacteria very well may have been present on the early Earth. Again, the data seems to suggest that. And the minimum genome size for a photosynthetic microorganism is on the order of about 1,700 gene products. So the nice thing is that the work in genomics seems to affirm what we could infer from the geochemical and the fossil record about the complexity of the earliest life on Earth. That is, this life seems to be intrinsically complex, and that to have organisms that can exist as freestanding organisms, they must, again, have a fairly high level of biochemical complexity. So what we've set up to this point is that life seems to appear early in Earth's history. It looks as if it appears rapidly or suddenly. It appears under hostile conditions, and that the first life on Earth, though it's microbial life, is biochemically complex. Some of these observations are counterintuitive. And when we look at these observations in light of our predictions, what we see is that the data seems to line up remarkably well. That, again, we predict that life appears early under hostile conditions, suddenly, that life in its minimal form is complex. We also predicted that life should show evidence for design. And this is what I want to talk about in the next few minutes, is the evidence for design that we see in biochemical systems. When I was a graduate student, I entered graduate school as an agnostic. I didn't know if God existed or not and really didn't care. And it was through studying biochemistry that I became convinced that there must be a creator. And this was in large measure because of the sophistication and the elegance of biochemical systems and the ingenuity in terms of how these systems were structured and how they function. And it was on that basis alone that I was convinced that there must be a mind that was behind everything. Well, in the last 30 years, there's been amazing advances in our understanding of life's chemistry, to the point where the case for design that we can make today is so much more robust. And we can actually take this intuition of design and formalize it into an argument for design after the work of William Paley and the watchmaker argument, where the defining features or characteristics that we now understand for biochemical systems are identical to those features that we would recognize as evidence for the work of a human designer. So in other words, when human beings design, when we create, when we invent, there's certain telltale signatures that are in those things that we produce that reflect the work of a mind. This was William Paley's point, where he argued that a watch and a rock are two very different things. A watch requires the work of a mind. A rock you can explain through the outworkings of natural processes. And the reason why you conclude a watch requires the work of a mind is it has certain properties that reflect that mind's activity. And this is true when we look at biochemical systems. The telltale hallmark features of biochemical systems are identical to what we would see as evidence for the work of a human designer. And so by analogy, we would argue that biochemical systems must be the product of a mind. And I'm going to illustrate that very quickly by looking at the information systems that we see inside the cell, DNA and proteins, which we've already talked about. Now, the way in which this, again, argument works is to point out that our common experience is that whenever we encounter information, we recognize that that information comes from the work of a mind. And so if we see information inside the cell, that again is suggestive of the work of a mind. And it's intriguing that in their essence, biochemical systems are information systems. And the two most prominent information molecules would be the nucleic acids like DNA and RNA and proteins. But it's not just merely the presence of DNA and RNA and proteins, information molecules, that to me suggest design and the work of an intelligent agent. It's how these systems are structured and how they function. Let me just give one example that to me is rather mind-boggling, and that is this recognition in the last few years on the part of both biochemists and computer scientists that the protein machinery that manipulates DNA is literally functioning in the same way that a computer system functions fundamentally. And to appreciate this, we need to consider the work of the British mathematician Alan Turing, who suddenly has become a household name thanks to the movie The Imitation Game, describing Turing's work during World War II, cracking the German Enigma code. But Turing cracked the code by building the very first computer system that was based on theoretical work that he did prior to World War II, where he laid out the foundations theoretically for how computer systems should function. And this is organized around what are called Turing machines, which are rather simple machines that consist of an input and output in a finite control. And here's a cartoon showing a Turing machine where the input is just a string of data that goes into this machine that can alter that data in an algorithmic manner according to a set of rules to produce an output string of data. And the finite control can only do very limited alterations of the data, but Turing's genius was to realize that the output of one machine could become the input of another machine. And so if you string together these Turing machines that can only perform simple operations, but again string them together in different ways, you can perform complex computations. And that's, again, the theoretical foundation for how computer systems function. Well, it turns out that, again, the machinery that manipulates DNA are literally Turing machines. The enzymes that manipulate DNA in processes like DNA replication or transcription are literally Turing machines, where the DNA strand, which harbors information, are both the input and the output strands. And again, the enzymes are Turing machines. And so this is a cartoon showing the process of DNA replication, where the DNA double helix is replicated into two daughter helices. And the diagram shows donuts and balls and blobs. Those are representations of the enzymes that are manipulating the DNA. But these, again, are taking that DNA, altering that information, producing an output that another enzyme will come along and, again, use as input, alter it, and produce an output. And when you combine the operation of multiple enzymes that only can do very limited changes to the DNA, you can actually perform rather complex processes like DNA replication. So again, this is really mind-boggling, but again, it highlights the fact that these systems have this appearance of design. Now, something else real quickly, I'm running out of time, but just in the next few minutes, another feature of the cell's chemical systems is that they are built around codes. And again, our experience is that codes come from the work of a mind. And the heart of the cell's information systems are the heart of the cell's information systems is the genetic code, which is a set of rules that decodes the information in DNA so that the cell's machinery can now produce another set of information molecules known as proteins. And these rules are not haphazard, accidental rules. They have a very elegant structure to them that produces an optimized code with respect to error minimization. And a few years ago, researchers actually generated random genetic codes and compared them to the one found in nature, and showed that the one in nature is a statistical outlier. It has this extreme level of optimization, which in and of itself suggests design. Simon Conway Morris, in his book Life's Origin, said this: "The genetic code found in nature displays eerie perfection and startling evidence of optimization." And so again, when we look at the nature of biochemical systems, and specifically the fact that these are information systems, we see what I think to be very compelling evidence that these systems are the work of a mind. And this, of course, is in line with the prediction that our creation model makes. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and stop there and turn the floor back over to you, Corey. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, this is the time where the fireworks begin and we start to raise objections. It's an opportunity for us to raise questions, ask for clarification. We want to line up Q&A opportunities right here by that microphone and over here by this microphone. We will continue to go back and forth, taking turns. The rules are simple, though. We want it to progress fairly quickly. And so what we want to do is just have you line up at the microphone, ask your question. Don't make it a statement or a lecture or anything like that. We'll let you sit there for a minute if there needs to be clarification or something like that. So why don't we have our scholars come back up, and we will sit at the table for a panel. You can ask questions to either of them, and we'll go from there. And if your buns are hurting just a little bit, stand up and shake it for just 1 second. We'll take 30 seconds, and then we will get started. Okay, let's go ahead and have a seat again. Buns are just fine now. Take it from me. Let's go ahead and have a seat. We've got 2 lines forming right now. Some open spaces over here. We're going to start with this side. And let me just reiterate, we've got mic bouncers by both mics, and we'll shut the mic off if it ends up being you giving the scholars a lecture. So we want a spirited dialogue here. We want you to be able to raise objections, but we want to make it such that the people behind you get a chance as well. So let's go ahead and just start over here. If we can have the audience be quiet now, we would appreciate that so we can get going on our Q&A session. Okay? Shh, thank you.
Yeah, check. My name's Roy Christian, and just found out about this symposium about 3 weeks ago in Indianapolis from a friend, and actually started reading one of your books and kind of understand how you look at things instead of days like they talk about in Genesis, but more in eras. And one thing that you make clear is that it's a very delicate balance in design, and what is top of mind in both the news and on my mind is whole global warming and how, it could, disrupt this, fine balance of design. And I'd like to, just hear your comments on that. Because one of the things you state in your book is that, during this era, through past evolution, we have, all the organic fuels, fossil fuels available for us, but to me, that's also could lead to our demise.
Okay, good question. We're currently in a very delicate balance. The last 2.5 million years, we've had an ice age cycle where we're delicately balanced between no ice and ice. And we go from 10 to 25% ice coverage. And we've noticed in previous ice age cycles is whenever the temperature rises to about 4 degrees centigrade above where it is now, you get a very rapid drop of temperature by about 12 degrees centigrade, which pushes us into the next ice age. And yes, the planet is warming, so there's concern that this could upset the climate stability that we've had for the past 9,000 years. One thing I'll tell you is this. Over the entire history of the Earth, we've only had one episode of exceptional climate stability, and that's the last 9,000 years. We should not take that for granted. Now, in my book, Hidden Treasures in the Book of Job, I make the point that the Bible tells us that God has put humanity in charge of the planet's resources to manage it for the benefit of all life. And it actually gives us some instructions on how to manage it for the benefit of all life. But it encourages us that when we face ecological crises, in advance, God has designed the earth and its life so we can find solutions that are optimally ethical and at the same time optimally economic. And so what I suggest in that book is that there are multiple solutions whereby we can cool the climate and keep the stability that we've had for the past 9,000 years and at the same time boost the world economy. So one example would be to replant the Sahara and Gobi deserts. If we were to do that, that would provide income for those regions of the world and a food supply, and at the same time would soak up huge quantities of greenhouse gases. And there's actually two other examples similar to that that you find in the book of Job and what I describe in detail in Hidden Treasures in the book of Job. So there are win-win solutions.
Thank you.
Okay, so I missed the very beginning of this. I don't know if you talked about this, but I was wondering if you reject a literal creation account because, there only being days in between the different portions of creation, and you guys saying that the universe is like 14 billion years old and that life appeared around 4 billion years ago. And if you reject the timing of the Mosaic creation account, why do you reject that and not some of the other portions of it that you talked about up on the screen?
Okay, good question. We'll be addressing that in much more detail tomorrow morning, but both Fuzz and I here are very comfortable signing a doctrinal statement that we believe that God created in 6 literal days, as Genesis 1 teaches. But the Hebrew word yom that's translated as day has 4 different literal definitions, 3 of which are used in the creation text in Genesis 1. So, for example, in creation day 1, it contrasts days and nights. That refers to the literal definition of yom as the daylight hours. On creation day 5, it contrasts seasons, days, and years, which was referring to the 24-hour period. And in Genesis 2:4, it uses the word yom, translated day, to refer to the entire creation week, which is a reference to the literal definition of yom as a long period of time. And in biblical Hebrew, the only word you have for a long period of time is the word yom. In other words, Moses had no other way to describe 6 consecutive long periods of time except to use the word yom. Now, at age 17, when reading Genesis for the first time, I'm concluded that these days must be 6 consecutive long periods of time. Number one, there's no evening and morning for the 7th day. You have a beginning and an ending to each of the first 6 days, but there is no closure on the 7th day. And in Psalm 95, John 5, and Hebrews 4, it tells us we're still in God's 7th day. And we're told in Romans that that day will not end until evil is conquered and removed. And so the 7th day, therefore, must be a long time period. And notice in Genesis 1, the human male and the human female are both made on day 6. Yet in Genesis 2, we have a significant passage of time between the creation of Adam and the creation of Eve, where, for example, Adam sees the trees grow. He tends the garden. He names all the birds and mammals that are there with him in the Garden of Eden. He becomes lonely. And when he finally is introduced to Eve, what you see in the Hebrew coming out of his mouth is the word hapa'am, at long last. Now, if the sixth day is a long period of time and the seventh day is a long period of time, the grammatical structure of Genesis 1 tells you all the days must be long periods of time, and therefore there's no contradiction between what Genesis teaches and what we find for the age of the earth and the age of the universe in science. On the other hand, we both agree with our young earth creationist friends that Adam and Eve were created just thousands of years ago. Not millions of years ago, but just a few tens of thousands of years ago. So that would be the last of God's creation activities before he rests from his work of creation. But you'll hear more about this tomorrow.
Hi. So I'd like to address something that I've challenged over every time I think about intelligent design. It's your probability argument. It's something, it's awe-inspiring that we're here today, that the probability that the universe was created and the way in which we find it and all the life aspects are come together today. It's awe-inspiring. It's also awe-inspiring that I'm here and not at the bar. So... But that's to say that I could have calculated the probability of coming here today, but the fact is that I came, right? The fact is that the universe is how it is, and it does exist, and it's awe-inspiring that it does exist. But I'm hoping you've addressed the counter-argument that how can you calculate the probability of something happening that's already happened and use that as an argument?
Yeah, this is where philosophy is a big help, and I know there's a number of philosophers here in the room. Richard Swinburne dealt with this more than 20 years ago because a number of astronomers were saying, well, of course we're here. We wouldn't be here unless the universe was designed the way it was. And what Richard Swinburne came up with was an analogy to expose the philosophical flaw. And he says, supposing you've been condemned to death, and you're going to be put before a firing squad. And there's 12 men there with high-powered rifles with telescopic sights that have all been told to pull the trigger and kill you. And they do. But you survive the event. And you look out at those 12 men and says, well, of course I survived because they all missed. And Richard Swinburne's point was the only way that you could have survived is if those 12 men purposed that you would miss or that you would live, and they purposely pointed their guns away from your heart, or somebody put blanks in their guns. The only rational explanation is somebody purposed that they would indeed survive the event. Likewise, he says, when you see this incredible evidence for fine-tuning design in the universe and our galaxy and solar system, the only rational conclusion is somebody beyond the universe must have wanted us to live.
All right. Hello? All right. Awesome. All right. So I think most atheists would agree with what you said about the probability. I feel like I think Victor Stinger, I guess, argued with you about the probability a little bit, but I think the linchpin, the atheist argument, is multiverse theory. I was curious why you didn't mention that.
Yes. My colleague Jeff Swearink has actually written a whole book called Who's Afraid of the Multiverse? And you'll find about a 7-page summary in my book, More Than a Theory. And let me just say at the first that the multiverse explains too much. By the way, back in the 1980s, I predicted that eventually the evidence for fine-tuning would become so overwhelming that atheists would have nowhere else to go but to propose a multiverse. If you haven't heard the thing, it's the idea that there's an infinite number of universes. Where all the universes are different even in terms of the laws of physics. And so they would argue that all these amazing features that make life possible are simply a result of the fact there's an infinite number of universes where one of them, by pure chance, would have the characteristics that would make life possible. The problem is that would explain away any intelligent design. So, for example, I could argue that those research papers I put up there are not the products of the minds of Stephen Hawking and Roger Penrose and Alexander Vlinkin, etc. They're the product of the multiverse. Because of the multiverse, you would have an infinite number of universes with an infinite number of planets, just like Earth, with infinite number of trees that would be shedding bark, where that bark would look like pages of paper with random markings on it, and with an infinite number of universes, you're going to have all the markings that show up on those pages. They didn't come from the mind of Stephen Hawking. The multiverse did it. And so what you're doing is you're exposing that these physicists who are appealing to a multiverse are being philosophically inconsistent. Now, a lot of people will make the comment that the multiverse is not testable, and therefore it's not science, because we can't have any way to observe these other universes. But here's the way it is testable. Supposing I had a coin here, and I flip it 1,000,000 consecutive times, and it comes up heads all 1,000,000 times. You could appeal to the multiverse and say, what if there's an infinite number of coins being flipped? Then by pure chance, one of them would come up with 1,000,000 consecutive heads. But before betting tails, I would suggest it be wise to look at both sides of the coin. We can do that with the universe. We can choose to examine the universe in more detail in the next week or month than we've examined it so far. And if in examining it in more detail, we see the evidence for design is increasing rather than decreasing, then that's a strike against the atheistic version of the multiverse. But hey, you can read the material we have on it for more background.
Thanks.
Fine.
Hi, I had a question about your biblical model of creation. You pointed to a lot of places where what the Bible says could be consistent with what science has already said and use that as support for sort of what the Bible says, but you left out a lot of claims that the Bible makes that aren't consistent. For example, in the psalm you presented, it says the earth is fixed in its foundation, which we know it isn't. So if you're going to take the second half of that verse literally, why not the first half? Same with the order of creation in Genesis, with the astronomical objects created before the earth, with birds created before land animals, things like that that aren't compatible with science.
Yeah, well, let me address the issue about Psalm 104, and then I'll let Hugh answer the question about Genesis 1. The point would be that we're interpreting the passages, again, in their immediate context using the best biblical interpretive methods. And so Psalm 104 is Hebrew poetry, which means there's going to be metaphorical language and hyperbole and things like that. But it doesn't mean that there's not truth or reality that's being depicted enshrouded in the literary devices that are part of poetry. And so when it says that the earth is fixed on its foundations, it will never be moved, that clearly is a poetic description. But I think it's reasonable to say, well, it's talking again about the rocky portion, and then you covered it with a garment like the ocean. So yes, indeed, it is poetic, but there's again hyperbole and metaphor and things like that that are being used as part of the literary device. And so the trick is then to tease out from that what is metaphor versus what is being communicated as, again, fact or reality. And so I don't think the idea that the rocky portion of the planet is established first, followed by the oceans as a secondary feature, is inconsistent with what the passage is saying, or that I'm being selective in that interpretation. I think it's, again, extracting meaning from the poetic text. And by the way, Job 38, 4 through 11 makes that same point. So it's consistent with two places in Scripture.
Yeah, it was Galileo who said the biggest mistake you can make in Bible interpretation is to get the wrong frame of reference or the wrong point of view. That's step one of the scientific method. Don't interpret until you establish the point of view. And the texts that speak about the earth being immovable are from the point of view of King David sitting on the earth. Since he's rotating at the same velocity as the foundations of the earth, from his point of view, the earth is immovable. Likewise, you go back to Genesis 1. Genesis 1:2, the Spirit of God is hovering over the surface of the waters of planet Earth. It's dark on the surface of the waters. It's giving us the account of the 6 creation days from the point of view of an observer on the surface of the waters of the earth, below the cloud layers, not above the cloud layers. And so what you see on creation day 1, let there be light. Notice the text doesn't say that God created the light or made the light. It says, let the light be. And this is when God transforms the atmosphere from being opaque, as it says in Job 38, he blanketed the clouds with darkness. That's an opaque cloud cover, and went from opaque to translucent. Light could pass through. Creation day 4, it says, let there be the great lights. Again, it's not creator made, let there be the great lights. Then it says, so that they may serve as signs to mark seasons, days, and years. And this is the first time creatures on the surface of the earth can actually see the positions of the sun, moon, and stars in the sky, because this is when the atmosphere goes from translucent to transparent. And what you notice is all the life mentioned before day 4 doesn't need to know where the sun, moon, and stars are in the sky. But all the life mentioned after day 4 is sufficiently complex that they need that information in order to regulate their biological clocks. And so the text is not saying the sun, moon, and stars are made on the 4th day. And likewise, when you look at the order of events, it's important to recognize that we now have evidence that land plants indeed predate the sea animals. We got both fossil evidence and isotopic evidence that establish that. And when it says sea mammals relative to land mammals, recognize that in creation day 5, it's talking about sea mammals generically, but in creation day 6, it doesn't even address land mammals generically. Instead, it jumps ahead to 3 specialized subcategories of land mammals, the late created ones that were most crucial for launching human civilization, something that the book of Job gives 2 whole chapters to addressing in detail what kinds of land mammals are being addressed. I'll talk about this tomorrow in more detail, but the bottom line is what we see recorded in the biblical creation text is perfectly in sync with the established fossil record.
Can I ask one follow-up question?
Sure.
What predictive capabilities does your creation model have? If you can make it consistent with what science has already created that or discovered, that's fine, but what can it present that just looking at the universe without the Bible can't do?
In other words, what you're asking is what would we predict the Bible to predict, say, for the future?
Sure.
In other
or
words,
about string theory or something we don't understand already.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I was trying to give some points where we got theologians 800, 900 years ago looking at the Bible and saying this is teaching an expanded universe, a space-time beginning for the universe, constancy of physics. So there you got a clear-cut example where it's not hindsight, but it's foresight. I guess what you're asking is, do we have any scientific examples that would actually be relevant to the 20th and 21st century? I give several examples of that in Hidden Treasures in the book of Job. For example, Job 38 speaks about cosmic darkness and actually describes it as a substance, not simply the lack of light. And when I was an undergraduate, I was taught that, hey, it's just simply the lack of light. But now we know that darkness is a real substance, and actually there's something called exotic dark matter, which is 5 times more abundant than ordinary dark matter. And what you see in Job is that this darkness has locations. And we now realize the locations of this dark stuff actually plays a critical role in making life possible. For example, if you want to stabilize the spiral structure of our galaxy for billions of years, it does require that darkness be of a certain quantity in certain locations to make that happen. So that's a more modern example.
But aren't you reading that into the text? I mean, no one said that before we discovered dark matter.
Well, I would agree.
Isn't that just, making them consistent again?
Again, I would take you back to the broad examples of Genesis 1, which is predicting the order of life on planet Earth. That was written thousands of years ago, long before we discovered it. I mean, I'll give you a more recent example. Even 4 years ago, when I was debating Michael Shermer, he was making the point the Bible got it wrong because we know sea animals come before land plants. My response at that time is, let's wait and see, because after all, land or plant fossils are not going to be preserved as easily as the bones and shells of animals. and therefore it's going to be much more challenging to find ancient fossils of land plants and finding much later fossils of sea mammals. But notice what happened in 2011. This was 3 years after I had that debate with Michael Shermer. They actually found fossil evidence, isotope evidence and fossil evidence that established that land plants were just as abundant on the continental land masses for 600 million years previous to the Cambrian explosion as 600 million years thereafter. Therefore, I think we really do have significant examples of the Bible with foresight. I would also say that the Bible is far more voluminous in predicting future human history than it is future scientific history. I mean, I can count maybe 200 or 300 places in the Bible where it predicted future scientific discoveries, but there's really thousands of places where the Bible predicted future historical events. And there's still several hundred that have yet to be fulfilled. So even in my lifetime, I can give you evidences of where certain things predicted, for example, about the second rebirth of the nation of Israel really did take place as Ezekiel had predicted them thousands of years ago.
Thank you.
By the way, one other thing you can get, I did do a debate with Tim Callahan of the Skeptic Society on whether or not the Bible has predictive power. So there you can listen to a 2.5-hour debate on the very question that you asked. And that's a downloadable MP3 from our website.
Thanks.
Sure.
Hi, thank you all for coming first off. This has been a really cool presentation. My question is, do like current population models indicate that it is possible that one man and one woman started the entire human race? Or is it against that where, you know, this group of people grew up in this landmass and then this group of people grew up at the same time and then eventually we have the Earth as we have it today?
Yeah, tomorrow my lecture is going to be specifically on that very question. But the long and the short answer is looking at genetic variability for people around the world using two special types of genetic markers, mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosomal DNA, looks as if, with regard to mitochondrial DNA, that every person on the planet traces an origin back to an ancestral sequence of mitochondrial DNA that anthropologists interpret as being a single female individual. And with regard to the Y chromosome, every male on the planet traces an origin back to a single ancestral sequence that, again, is interpreted as being a single male individual. The latest work actually places the time for what's referred to as mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosomal Adam at essentially the same point in time. And so that's extremely provocative. Now, evolutionary biologists would argue that the mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosomal Adam can't be understood as the biblical Eve and biblical Adam because they argue that there were populations of humans and that there were many Eves and many Adams, that the other Eves' lineages died out and the other Adams' lineages died out. That's how evolutionary biologists interpret this. But what I'll point out tomorrow in some detail is that, first of all, when that data is being viewed from an evolutionary framework, by definition there has to be a population. And that's essentially an embodiment of how evolutionary biologists view the mechanism of evolution happening, namely that it's a population-level phenomena, that individuals don't evolve, populations evolve. So therefore, if you're looking at that data from an evolutionary framework, you have to posit that there were many Eves and Adams because it's nonsensical in an evolutionary framework to say otherwise. So that's a theory-laden interpretation, if you will. Now, the other people would argue that there are these genetic models, mathematical models that relate genetic variability to mutation rate and effective population size. And by manipulating those equations, you can estimate population size from variability in mutation rate. And they argue that when you do those calculations, you wind up with population sizes that are several thousand, not a pair of individuals. And I'll go into some detail about this tomorrow, but the fact of the matter is that those mathematical models have never been validated as actually performing with accuracy. And when we look at conservation biology, where people are attempting to actually validate those mathematical models, they're discovering that the models aren't performing, and they're even questioning whether those relationships, which are kind of standard fare in a population genetics course, they're questioning whether or not those equations are even valid or those relationships are valid, meaning that nobody can really show that there wasn't a primordial pair, that there was a population with any kind of genuine rigor or genuinely valid methods. And so given that there is these individual sequences that go back to individual males and an individual male and an individual female, says to me that there's credibility to the biblical account of human origins. But we'll go into a lot of detail on that tomorrow.
Okay. Thank you very much.
I hope that you will pardon my accent, but I really appreciated some of the remarks we made about the importance of establishing a reference point from which to posit an interpretation, and about the need for philosophical consistency. Just in the past few years in my life, I have become very much aware of the importance of philosophy in science, and it has caused very much a seismic shift in my way of looking at things. So I was wondering, how would you describe your philosophy of science?
Well, as you know, the prevailing view for how science operates from a philosophical framework is methodological naturalism, which basically argues that when you engage in the scientific enterprise, you only seek mechanistic natural process explanations for the universe and phenomena within the universe. That, in a nutshell, it's sometimes referred to as provisional atheism or benchtop atheism. And as you can tell, neither Hugh or I ascribe to that view, because that view would limit the introduction of intelligent agency into a scientific framework, which we think actually makes the enterprise of science not about discovering truth, but about discovering natural process explanations, whether they exist or not. And so I think it actually limits the power of science to discover truth. But I don't think that methodological naturalism is completely bankrupt. So I actually like to adopt a view that I would call soft methodological naturalism, where I believe it's reasonable to start an investigation with an orientation towards finding some kind of mechanistic explanation, and then if the data or the evidence is pointing to the involvement of intelligent agency, to try to figure out how to incorporate that into the model. And from my perspective, that approach has a biblical precedent in the sense that we would understand that God has put in place providential processes that help to sustain creation. And so we should expect to see process and mechanism as part of the natural order of things and should strive to understand that as Christians. But we should be open to the fact that there very well may be places where, again, divine intervention has taken place, and that I think we can actually study it with the construct of science.
Testable in this context that Genesis says that God created for 6 days and rested on the seventh day. Given that we're in the seventh day right now, methodological naturalism is exactly what we expect during the human era. But we can actually use that as a test, namely that if what the Bible is saying is correct about creation, we should be able to see a discontinuity between the human era and what preceded before the human era. During the human era, strictly naturalistic process, but before the human era, it'd be a combination of naturalistic process and supernatural intervention. And so we point to a number of books as where that discontinuity in science is quite evident, where we really do see a difference, particularly in the biological realm of what was going on, quote, the seventh day, the human era, as compared to what was taking place before we human beings showed up.
Hey, I'm sorry. You made a strong argument about the necessity of a designer because of the nature of dark energy. I was very curious to find out that Professor Susskind, one of the authors of this Journal one-page paper that you talked about, is currently interested in looking at the universe from this holographic, well, the principle is called the holographic principle, and I'm sure that you've heard about it. So I'm just curious if you think this is something that merits attention, or how you discuss this.
Well, Susskind is a theoretical physicist that loves to be controversial, and a lot of his atheist friends have been quite critical of some of his ideas, but he loves to speculate. And I think we need to permit these theoretical physicists to speculate. In fact, there's a journal called Physics Letter B, and it's a journal basically devoted for theoretical physicists to engage in fairly wild speculations. I'm in favor of that because often, for example, they develop mathematical formulations that actually have application completely outside their speculation. And if it wasn't for us giving them the freedom to speculate, then we would never have those mathematical developments. So I'm all in favor of it, even though it may have no bearing in reality. And I think Leonard, for example, is quite willing to admit that some of his speculations have no possible bearing in reality, but they're fun. And so they engage in it, and hey, you know, Hollywood needs new scripts anyway, so let's go for it.
Thank you.
Hi. First, thank you for your wonderful and inspiring presentation. I will summarize Dr. Ross' presentation as God's evidence for the design of the universe, the galaxy, and Dr. Rana's presentation as evidence of the design of life. But my question is not to question the design of the universe or the life. So I was questioning what do you think the purpose of the design? Because we think for every design, we human beings, it should have purpose. If you design a watch, you need to keep track of the time. Is this design for the benefit of the life? But for me, I was thinking that life on Earth, every species on the planet would go extinction one time. So what's the purpose of this design?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because if this design is real, it begs the question, why?
Yeah.
Why the design? What purpose does it have? One thing you'll see in the book of Job and Psalm 104 in particular, is that all the life that God has been creating over the past 3.8 billion years, all the geological processes that he's been manipulating over the past 3 or 4.5 billion years, is designed to make a home for humanity. So it seems like we're the epitome or the focus of all the design. But that raises another question. Why does God want human beings? Why does he want us to be able to develop global high technology civilization? So it's a question that I raise in this book, Why the Universe is the Way It Is, making the point that what distinguishes Christianity from all the other religions of the world, it's a two-creation model. What I notice in the other religions is that it's a one creation, where God creates a paradise for humanity. And what's interesting is all these religions claim that we lost paradise and that God or gods are on a mission to bring us back to paradise. What I found in the Bible was a different story. God is not intending to bring us back to paradise. He wants to take us to a completely different realm with different physics, different dimensions. But it won't happen until evil is conquered and removed. In other words, the biblical position is God creates his universe and human beings to be a tool in his hand to eliminate all evil and suffering, while at the same time enhancing the free will freedom of human beings. And once that is accomplished, the universe will have fulfilled its purpose, and God replaces it with a brand new realm with different physics. Why? Because evil and suffering won't exist. You don't need gravity anymore. Don't need electromagnetism. Don't need the strong and weak nuclear force. You don't need length, width, height, and time. He can take us in a completely different realm. And if you want a fun exercise tonight, read the last 2 chapters of the Bible and see if you can figure out the new laws of physics and the new dimensionality of the new creation and what your life is going to be like there if you so choose to go.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Austin, and I got a question for Dr. Fuzz, if you may. You described in one of your very first slides in Genesis 1:2 that you believe the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters and could have been protecting seeds in the land. But a translation of the word for Spirit of God here is actually, it's the same word that they use for wind when in the flood story, the wind that draws the waters to overcome the earth. What is your view on the use of wind in this statement? And also, Genesis 1:11 and 2:5 both imply that there were seeds in the land and God commanded the land to bring forth vegetation from the seeds. So I'm not quite getting, how does that align with your theory of how the earth, was originally in molten form? Where do the seeds come from? How do they get into the picture in general? And what is your specific view on the order of events of creation between the times the earth was formed and the time that God commands the earth to bring forth vegetation?
Okay. Yeah, it is true that the Hebrew word ruah can mean wind. It's not uncommon for Hebrew words to have a range of meanings. But if you look at Deuteronomy 32, which I mentioned, it does use the word rahap, which is translated as hovering. The only other time, to my knowledge, in the Old Testament is in Genesis 1:2 and in Deuteronomy 32. And again, there it's talking about the Spirit of God hovering over the nation of Israel. In the context, that's the way to understand how to translate ruah, is not as a wind, but as the Spirit of God. And so given the similarity in the imagery, that I think it makes sense that you're looking at, again, the Spirit of God, not a wind blowing over the surface of the earth. And, I'll be the first to admit that what we're suggesting here is an inference from the text. It's not something that the text directly states, that there were seeds there. But given that you're looking at the Spirit of God hovering over something very precious to God, which would be the seeds of Jacob, the burgeoning nation of Israel, that there, by, again, comparison, must be something very precious to God that he's protecting under those harsh, hostile conditions. So that's why we would argue that it must be something akin to the seeds of life, or the very first life on earth. So, and if that's the case, then that life would be very different than what is explicitly described in, the third day and the 56 days of creation. So that's the reasoning there. Now, was there something else that you were asking that am I missing something?
Well, I think I know what you're talking about. Creation Day 3 that talks about life on the land. And it uses the word déchet, which is basically a very generic term for plant life, basically any kind of life that engages in photosynthesis. Then it gives 3 examples, and it's not meant to be an exhaustive list. These are 3 kinds of what would apply as déchet. And it mentions seeds and trees and fruit. That's the English translation. If you actually look at the Hebrew words are far more generic than what you see in a typical English translation. But that's something we're going to be addressing tomorrow. And by the way, it's in a lot of detail in this book here, Navigating Genesis.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, in the interest of time, we will have the scholars come on up as we close. They'll stay here for 15, 20 more minutes, maybe answering questions at the stage here. But we do encourage you to come back tomorrow as Dr. Ross will be talking about Navigating Genesis, a scientist's perspective, and Dr. Rana, who was Adam, searching for the origin of humanity. Epictetus, the Greek philosopher, said that we've been given 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason, to listen more. I think oftentimes there is a naturalist secular milieu over the university that makes one think that Christians believe by faith and there is no reason, when in fact I think that it is the most reasonable faith if you'll just give it a chance and have a dialogue. That's what we seek to do through the symposium and other endeavors like this, to generate more light than heat. In fact, those of you who have mentioned Victor Stenger, Dr. Stenger is a bright guy. He was a contributing author in our recent book, Is Faith in God Reasonable? He died just a couple of months ago. He is one of the foremost new atheists, a former philosopher and physicist. Dr. Carlson, Erica Carlson, physics professor, and myself will be co-leading a group on his book, God and Multiverse. If you want to join us for that, if you're a grad student or a faculty member, come talk with us about that. That'll begin in about 2 weeks. Let me mention one other thing. As someone trained in theology and philosophy, with great respect for science, I do appreciate why contemporary scientific evidence has led the eminent agnostic and astronomer who worked at NASA, Robert Jastrow, to say this: for the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, and by that I mean reason alone, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He is about to conquer the highest peak, and as he pulls himself over the final rock, he's greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries. I think science finds its home in a theistic universe rather than an atheistic universe. Thanks for coming tonight. Hope to see you with a dozen or more talks tomorrow. Come on up and join the scholars for some conversation.